want to talk for a few minutes about Kathleen Jamie's essay Pathologies from her collection, 2012 collection, Sightlines. Just to offer a few comments because we didn't have time in class to go into much detail around this essay, and it raises some important questions and describes some significant textual strategies and I guess language practices that go into negotiating the kinds of relationships and connections and disconnections that Jamie wants to trace between the human and the non-human, between the unnatural and the natural. So the essay begins with a brief account of her mother's death and the aftermath of that, in which Jamie describes as feeling like a kind of, and this is her phrase, a strange hiatus. A strange hiatus. The essay is going to trace a number of gaps, I guess, or fissures that emerge cognitively, I think, in the wake of confrontations with human mortality and with our own mortality, as we start to think through the limits of human experience and the limits of what it means to be a human being. The ways, in another sense, in which we tend to sort of pull away from any sense of being an animal or of being natural creatures. Humans want to disavow, often, Jamie suggests, their own animal being. And this essay, as it invites us to consider the ways in which we construct ourselves as human in relation to our bodies and to physiology, and in particular to the nature would be the right word, I think, of our flesh and our fleshly being, our musculature, our organs, and things like that. You'll notice that it's as with in many of the other essays in the collection, it's language that seems to concern Jamie principally. How words create bridges across these different kinds of estrangements and hiatuses and gaps and disconnections that the human intellect and human self-conception tend to want to create. So the work that this essay is engaged in inasmuch as it is also constituted by words, has to do with an engagement with the nature of metaphor and metaphor making, with the bridging, the attempts at least at bridging that words and various kinds of names tend to undertake. So, as I was saying, it starts off with her mentioning a stock phrase. As her mother's dying, she's told, it's here on the first page, that nature would be allowed to take its course. Nature needs to be allowed to take its course. And this is a cliche, it's a stock phrase, uttered in order to give comfort to people, and to kind of get us through the beginning of mourning and grieving. But it's really the language itself that starts to draw Jamie's attention. And she immediately, within a few pages, starts to ask herself, what exactly is this nature that we're talking about here? I often thought, she says, about the phrase, letting nature take its course, how it sounded like a gallantry, how it suggested acceptance and timeliness. So there's the time frame of that strange hiatus that she's engaging with. She jumps to a month later in the opening paragraphs of the essay, where she describes being at a conference, which is another occasion of verbal interchange, of people talking. And it's a conference about humanity's relationship with other species, so the human and the non-human. And she says there's a government minister and a climate scientist giving dire warnings, all speaking, she says, that is the scientists, activists, writers, all speaking with urgency about how we have to, and here's another quoted phrase. You'll notice how highly iterative and reiterative her writing is. We have to reconnect with nature. We have a crisis because we have lost our ability to see the natural world or to find it meaningful. Notice how world, nature, language, and the visual in particular are all tied up in how she's putting this problem here. There had been a breakdown in reciprocity. There's a give and take, a back and forth that she wants to really at least touch on, if not recreate. And again, that reciprocity is going to have something to do with likeness, something to do with analogy, and something to do with metaphors and metaphor making here. Humanity had taken a wrong path. There are bad metaphors, or language isn't working, or something's not right. We are, she says later in the essay, not seeing, and had become destructive and insulated. That disconnectedness needs to be, if not remedied, at least addressed, she's suggesting here. But she says, what was it, that is nature, exactly, and where did it reside? I'd felt something at my mother's bedside, she says, almost an animal presence. There's something about our animal being that's tied in with our mortality that is felt here. She wants to find a way to get that feeling, that experience into words, or to acknowledge when she says nature, or when someone talks about nature, that there's something of a kind of Cata Croesus being produced. A Cata Croesus, a kind of substitution of metaphor for any kind of what might feel like a kind of actual functional word, a word that says what something is, that has some kind of ontological link to what it is that it's naming. There's something about naming here that's being put at issue. A Cata Croesus is the name for a metaphor making that substitutes for there being a word that does that kind of directed work. So it's a mark both of kind of creative bridge building and also of disconnection. So that's sort of what she's after here. She's putting nature in quotation marks and suggesting that it is catachrestic, that it isn't exacting, or it doesn't disclose as a given what it is that it might mean. But that meaning has to be questioned and thought about. We don't know what nature is, even though we seem to talk about it all the time. The rest of the essay involves a visit to a pathology lab where Jamie converses with Professor Frank Carey, who leads her through some examinations under a microscope of human tissue samples. It's significant, too, that Professor Carey works in a hospital in Dundee, which is across the River Tay from Jamie's own home. So this is a kind of looking, a kind of visual intervention that by looking through microscopes that she wants to practice, that's tied to her immediate sense of place. In fact, one of the things that she's questioning here, and that comes up in the vocabulary of the essay itself, is how to situate her own sense of belonging, belonging in place, belonging on the planet, her own sense of being something like a human animal, or really a kind of human-animal amalgam. So you have, often in the essay, different kinds of affects, different kinds of emotional responses offered up. She asks for empathy at one point, and tries to sort of think empathetically about the people whose tissue samples they're looking at. These sort of scientific objects of study and of diagnosis are actually parts of living human bodies. They belong to somebody who's alive, who's conscious, who has a life. So empathy is something. One of the lab assistants says, what a shame, when they discover a malignancy. in a tissue sample. So there's something about empathizing, about building, again, a kind of emotional or feeling bridge across the boundaries between human beings that emerges from this kind of looking, this kind of seeing. So it's a form of metaphor making. The other sort of affects that are described are named something like squeamishness. Are you feeling squeamish or seasick? She's asked by Frank Carey in the essay. So there's this sense of sort of kind of the flip side of empathy, of a kind of disconnection, of an inability to look or of an inability to approach, maybe because of the smell, maybe because of a certain kind of revulsion, the body of another human. So our animal being is both generative of empathy, of feeling, and also of a kind of closing off, of repulsion and of disconnection. When she looks through the microscope at one particular tissue sample, she starts to describe her experience in the form of a kind of analogy or likeness. She says the microscope, so we're talking about the visual apparatus, and make that clear here. The microscope was a double-headed one, so there's a kind of division and a kind of sort of complexity of the gaze. The looking is never done here in a kind of singular, authoritative, monocular fashion, but it's always a little bit plural. We also have dialogue going on here between her and Professor Carey. So humans are positioned as speaking social creatures. The double-headed microscope suggests a kind of intersubjective looking. And you're looking at someone else's, the interior of someone else's body as well. The microscope was a double-headed one, which allowed us both to see the same slide. That's both she and Professor Carey. And for one unused to microscopes, it was like slipping into a dream. So there's some kind of fantasy, I suppose, at work here. I was admitted to another world. Otherness is invoked, where everything was pink. I was looking down from a great height upon a pink countryside, a landscape. So this is kind of what I wanted to mention here, that there's a large conceit or metaphor built up that connects the interior of the body to its exterior situation, to the landscape. And notice that it looks like a landscape here. There was an estuary with a north bank and a south. In the estuary were wing-shaped river islands or sandbanks, as if it was low tide. It was astonishing, a map of the familiar. When we come to Don Mackay, you'll see that astonishment is a key affect in his work as well. It's an affect that produces defamiliarization, or in this case, Jamie describes this as surprise. Surprise. It was our local river, she says, as seen by a hawk. So a kind of aerial view is what we get now. And then she says, it's like the Tay, I said, at low tide with the sandbanks. Like the Tay, so a likeness. Here's another kind of, in the simile, there's a kind of metaphor making, a kind of bridging that's taking place. She's seeing connections between the animal, fleshly, interior being of the human body and the exterior world. And she's trying to make that bridge work. Professor Carey immediately says, I love the names of those sandbanks. Said Professor Carey. He immediately says that. So notice how in this process of seeing and reseeing, naming and language, particularly the local act of naming, the Tay and other kinds of names that are attached to that place, really comes to the foreground. So the language is participating somehow, Jamie's own language, saying, intersubjectively, talking back and forth, is involved in that bridge making, that kind of empathetic connecting. And that's what she says a few pages on in what she calls, they're looking at stomach lining in this at this point in the essay. She says, in what she calls the wilderness of our stomachs, the wilderness of our stomachs. So the kind of non-human world that lives inside the human body. She is starting to evolve, as she puts it, a new kind of seeing a fresh eye. Sometimes it needs a fresh eye or a looser mind, says Professor Carey. And do you think, they're in dialogue at the bottom of the page, and do you think there are other things, other associations we're just not seeing? Jamie asks. What are we just not seeing? Does the essay, we can ask ourselves, in describing, in writing out this experience, actually produce a new way of seeing, or does it open up, loosen, as she says, the reader's mind a little bit to offer the potential for a different way of seeing? A way of seeing, we're told, that tries to answer or to address in some form that question of what it is that constitutes the natural, how it is that we interrelate to our own natural being, to the nature that constitutes us, in fact. Remember that nature is highly, at least in terms of the affects, how we experience it, and also maybe here in the way that Jamie describes it, is framed by a kind of ambivalence, by a kind of two-sidedness that we want to pay attention to. It's unsettled for Jamie. That duplicity gets developed on the following page in what I think is a really key paragraph in this essay, so I'll just read through it for us. She writes, after her experience, I drove home along the river I fancied I'd seen in the poor man's liver cells. So fancy, imagination, is a way of concocting these metaphors or these likenesses, or this, maybe this kind of assemblage of likeness and unlikeness, since here you'll notice that she distances herself from those imaginative acts and describes it as a kind of fancy, as she's a little bit skeptical, I think, about the power of those fanciful associations to be utterly true. It's in a way that makes sense, because it's not a landscape per se. It is a stomach lining there, or a liver, that we're talking about. So metaphors overlay other images onto what it is that you're looking at, and we get a kind of a vacillation or a movement back and forth between tenor and vehicle, between imaginary landscape and factical tissue, material tissue. And this is what she develops here, in fact. The tide was in, no sandbanks, so she doesn't see the sandbanks that they love to name, that Professor Carey loved. And here's a key sentence: the inner body, plumbing, and landscapes and bacteria. So just a set of, just a list, just a set of descriptors, no verb in that sentence. The outer world also had flown open like a door, and I wondered as I drove, and I wonder still, what is it that we're just not seeing? And it's in italics there. Notice that this is provoking, that the metaphors, that the kind of connections are provoking a question and creating openness, opening doors, producing liminal thresholds, spaces of interchange or reciprocity. But it's an unsettled reciprocity. Inside and outside create reciprocals and engage in a kind of trade back and forth. There were just some things, she says, a little further down on the page, to come to terms with. And that's really what she's trying to do here, to come to terms with that kind of interchange, with this sort of bridge work. Coming to terms doesn't necessarily mean settling, but it does mean for her a certain kind of astonishment or wonder, not in the sense of a kind of romantic sublime, but this is really a rather knowing wonder, a kind of knowing unknowing that she wants. The top of page 40, she says, I thought, and in quotation marks again, another sort of iterative moment, I thought, we are just meat, then called it back. Flesh, bodily substance, colons and livers and hearts had taken on a new wonder. So we're not just meat, but that fleshly aspect, that animal aspect, invites us to reflect on our humanity, and particularly the miscued or misdirected human relationships to the outer world, that outer world is actually within us, that we're not so separated off as we might fancy ourselves to be. The natural evidence of our mortality, Professor Fleming had called it, she says. That's the deal. So again, a quotation, natural evidence of our mortality. That's the deal. If we are to be alive and available for joy and discovery, then it's as an animal body available for cancer and infection and pain. She ends the essay with a call to, I guess, as she says, plead for the non-human, to recognize that our humanity, in fact, consists in a living reciprocity that we embody between the human and the non-human, that we are porous beings, beings of interchange, open beings, beings who ask questions, maybe, wondrous questions or questions around this idea of wonder. That's how she names, I think, this kind of questioning attitude, this way of seeing and unseeing at the same time. That's wonder. But it's a wonder that also can produce still a bit of squeamishness. She talks about the kind of smell after attending an autopsy. That heart smell haunted me. For a while it was unshakable, as though, like a wolf, I could sense it everywhere. The wolf in here is a figure of sort of a kind of human ecological remedial relationship. The last wolf had gone extinct in Scotland years ago, and then it had, as Jamie points out, the wolf has been reintroduced by humans, so that the wilderness, the wild being, is potentially being either managed by human intervention or perhaps being let go, being enabled. The other than human is perhaps something that, as human beings, we need to attend to shepherd. So she kind of frames her essay a little bit with this image of the Scottish wolf as embodying that ambivalence that I've been talking about between the human and the non-human, between the animal and the human. This is the last sentence. It felt surprisingly good. So there's the surprise again, a bit of astonishment, a bit of wonder. It felt surprisingly good to be part of that rough tribe of the mortal. And good to be well, so she's still healthy here, able to stride outside again, back into the cool March breeze. This is kind of a leave-taking, of course, but one thing to notice is how the words themselves mix together this kind of reciprocity, this interchange between in and out. She goes outside, but to go outside is to go into the breeze. So she goes into the outdoors. The in and out trade themselves back and forth, the inner and outer world. And while she doesn't finally, in a sense, come to terms in a teleological sense, she doesn't close off on this problem. What she seems rather to do, what gives her a kind of comfort maybe, a kind of surprising comfort, sort of a mix there of affects again, is an embracing of that questioning, an embracing of that ambivalence of health and pathology, of animal and human, of life and death.